Today, I'm going to reveal the secret narrative that has been woven under the surface of the Ghibli movies. I was really young when I watched the Ghibli movies for the first time, and when I got older, I forgot they existed. But they stayed in the recesses of my mind like a foggy, distant memory or a fever dream. But I live in Canada, and a few years ago, all the Ghibli movies were put onto Netflix. Have you ever been in a place, in a dream, and then when you're older, you go to that place in real life, and you're confused, and you're like, am I God? That was what watching Castle in the Sky was like. I thought I made that shit up. Turns out I just convinced myself I'm a lot more creative than I actually am. Every Ghibli movie is like nostalgia you didn't know you had. I got obsessed with that. And now that all the movies were readily available to me, I watched them. Several times. I know it looks like I constantly exude masculine confidence, but in my normal day-to-day, I'm a pretty anxious guy. And a good way to cope with the horrors of not being dead yet is to watch a cottagecore lesbian aesthetic white bitch movie created by an ironically cranky old Japanese man. And by doing so every night for the past 4 years, I discovered something! In this video, I will explain to you how all the Ghibli movies are connected in the same universe. The Ghibli-verse, if you will. Okay, so technically that's a lie. Out of the 22 Ghibli movies that there are, I'm going to be talking about 10 of them. Plus Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind. Because even though that's not a Ghibli movie, it kind of just spiritually is. Basically, all the movies that are the brainchild of this motherfucker, Hayao Miyazaki. Movies that are both written and directed by him. Ones that he had full creative control over. So I'm not going to be talking about the ones he just helped write or did some storyboards for. So instead of Ghibli-verse, I suppose you could say the Hayao Miyazaki feature-length film cinematic universe, minus Castle of Cagliostro, because that's part of the Lupin the Third pre-existing IP, and I don't want to deal with that can of worms. Or abbreviated to the HMFLFCUMTCOTLTTBPEIPAIDWTDWTCOW. Sorry if Ghibli-verse is a little bit more catchy. I guess I could say Miyazaki-verse or Miyazaki Cinematic Universe, although I'm pretty sure MCU is taken. Although that would include Goro Miyazaki, and God knows I'm not going to watch Tales of Earthsea again for this video. Do you ever feel bad for Goro? Sometimes I feel bad for Goro, but then after watching his movies halfway through, I leave to go smoke a cigarette. Okay, so movies that we will be talking about in order of release is not Castle of Cagliostro, but Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind, Castle in the Sky, My Neighbor Totoro, Kiki's Delivery Service, Porco Rosso, Princess Mononoke, Spirited Away, Howl's Moving Castle, Ponyo, The Wind Rises, and Boy and the Heron. So, what did we learn from these movies? In Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind, we are introduced to a post-apocalyptic barren wasteland stricken by war and the threat of the ever-encroaching toxic jungle, or Sea of Decay in the original Japanese. Yes, I watched these all in Japanese. I know some people have their superiority complexes about reading their anime rather than enjoying it, but I digress. Nausicaa takes place 1,000 years after a disastrous war called the 7 Days of Fire, which resulted in the collapse of industrialized civilization. Man-made giant warriors created out of living biomatter that somehow had the ability to hone colossal destructive power now lay dead, turned to stone, and from their corpses sprung the aforementioned toxic jungle. Throughout the film, the jungle is posed as a neutral threat to the world that needs to be contained or even destroyed, which is a really hard thing to do as the jungle has a militia of giant pillbug-like alien creatures going around spreading and protecting it. But our hero Nausicaa learns the truth, that it's actually just nature's purification process for ridding the Earth's pollution humans made centuries before. While this happens, a pointless war goes on between two factions, the Tormekians and the Pedgites, and Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind end up in the middle of it. I think I'm starting to see some themes here, or whatever could they be? The world's technology is a mishmash of both giant flying airships, flying machines, tanks and guns, and also medieval architecture, agriculture, and knight's armor. In Castle in the Sky, the world is relatively normal, taking place somewhere in the early 1900s. That is, except that in this movie, there was an ancient group of people called the Laputians that lived on giant floating sky islands, but then mysteriously abandoned them 700 years ago. It is shown that these ancient people had highly advanced technology, but was eventually forgotten alongside the islands themselves. The main cast of characters then find the castle in the sky, and look, those creatures sure do resemble the ones in the toxic jungle, and these are just straight up fox squirrels. The giant robots that populate the castle are also seemingly seemingly not exactly, but pretty close to the giant fire giants from Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind. A lot of connections between these two movies. The technology of the film, other than the Laputan people, is that of any common 1900 setting, with trains, planes, and cars, although cars are considered uncommon, which would make sense if they were just invented.
Wow, it's a real automobile. We don't see many of those around here.
But along with that, there's still giant flying contraptions, giant military blimps, weird turrets that look medieval somewhat, and everything else. Miyazaki will not be held down to realism. We see magic crystals that use spells to activate them, and in Patsu's mining village, we learned that the whole entire earth is filled with an ancient mineral called Ethereum, or Volucite if you're a purist. The ancient Laputians knew how to mine this, but it somehow got forgotten along the way. This is the same crystal that the ancient people used to actually make their floating castles float. Totoro takes place in 1950s Japan, and this is our first glimpse of spirits and how they work. We learn that they can only be seen when they want to be seen, but if you have enough childhood wonder like May, that you might be able to get a glimpse of them anyways. We also learn that they're connected to nature, as in Totoro is very connected to his tree. We also see him alter reality as the opening to his den will open and close, seemingly at his will. Kiki's delivery service is a little bit ambiguous to when it is set, from anywhere to the 50s or the 60s. The town Kiki lands in is based on Stockholm, but definitely isn't Stockholm. We learn about witches and how they are integrated into society, how they can only be females. Witches are seemingly rare, but not unheard of. People aren't going to freak out if they see a witch fly on a broomstick. It might just be a cool thing to see. Porco Rosso takes place after World War I, leading into World War II in the Adriatic Sea. And this is where we see our first curse resulting in human transformation. This happened when a young Marco Russellini, or Marco Pagò in the Japanese version, got into a plane fight at the end of the war and had a near-death experience, seeing all of his friends and enemies rise into the sky in a dreamlike expanse, after which he wakes up and returns as a pig. Obviously. This is also seen as something normal. The government isn't going to try and dissect Porco. This is just something that in this world, some people are pigs sometimes, you know, it's not a big deal. At the end of the movie, the curse is only broken after a kiss from a 17-year-old. Maybe. It's unclear. Princess Mononoke takes place in Miramachi, Japan, and we are introduced to Ashitaka and the Amishi people, and most importantly, more spirits, and now gods. The distinction between the two seemingly being that gods are more intelligent, large beasts, and spirits are incorporeal, unknowable creatures. Forests and nature are protected by these said gods and act in direct opposition to the character of Lady Eboshi and also just the progress of humanity in general. Nature ultimately ends up losing to Eboshi after she kills the Shishigami, forest spirit. But we do see at the end of the movie that the Kodama do return after this forest spirit dies, meaning that there might be some hope for nature after all. I'm seeing some themes here. I wonder what they could be. Next is Spirited Away, which is probably the most in-depth look we get into the spirit world. In the early 2000s, we see Chihiro's family get transferred into the spirit world, in which we see our second instance of a curse resulting in human transformation, with Chihiro's parents turning into pigs. Obviously. We learn about spirit society and spirit magic, and we also have another repeat offender with the soot sprites, which appeared in Totoro. Once Chihiro's family leaves the spirit world, they all lose their memories. And we also learn that time from inside the spirit world correlates to time outside of the spirit world. So Chihiro's family will eventually learn that 3 days of their life just up and went. Next is Howl's Moving Castle, and this is our first instance of not knowing where any relative time period where it might actually take place. We see a world with wizards and kingdoms that have developed into the Industrial Revolution to, of course, create giant flying machines. Miyazaki might have a few patterns. We also see our third example of a curse resulting in human transformation, this one making you old and ugly. Oh, and look at those turrets. I'd recognize those anywhere. The fortress and castle in the sky. In the world of Ponyo, set in 2007, we are introduced to Ponyo's father, Fujimoto, a man who gave up being human for that sweet, sweet goddess Usi. Ponyo, originally a goldfish but wanting to become a human, does so by spilling some magical soup and creating the whole entire world out of balance by bringing the moon too close, and the whole world is underwater, and there's dinosaurs now, and millions are presumably dead. A lot happens, and it's not really explained, but it's a fun movie about children, so we don't focus on that. In The Wind Rises, we follow the life of Jiro Hirakoshi, a real-life person, and nothing much magical happens. It's just kind of a nice story about a guy who works for the fascist Imperial Japanese Army. But he's one of the good ones, okay? You know, he give him a break. He's following his dreams. He's making planes. Like the ones for Pearl Harbor. Jokes aside, I actually really like this movie, but it does kind of feel like if you made Oppenheimer, but then stopped the movie right before the bomb happens to focus on a fictionalized tuberculosis wife. I don't know. Maybe learning about him did, kind of sway my opinions of this movie, but it's really nice. You know, it's a good movie. Like, I guess you could say that they aren't on the same level. And to be fair, he does have a dream in the last 30 seconds of the movie where he does show some remorse. Speaking of which, he has a lot of dreams. He has 3 dreams in which he talks to his hero and inspiration, Giovanni Battista Caproni. Barista? Is that right? Barista? I still don't know if I can actually pronounce it. But Battista. Giovanni Battista Caproni. It's all very vague and dreamlike, obviously. And none of it is confirmed if he's actually talking to him or not, like through his dreams, but probably not. I just think it's interesting to note.
So you think we are sharing this dream?
I hope so.
And lastly, The Boy and the Heron, in which we follow Mahito at the near end of the Second World War and his struggles through losing his mother and trying to get used to his aunt as a viable replacement. We learned that a very long time ago, a meteor fell from the sky onto Japan, and then 30 years later, an old guy found it, who's actually Mahito's great-granduncle, and he built a tower around it because it was like super magical and stuff. And then within that tower, he can now harness the power of the meteorite by using a stone within the meteorite that he uses to create magical worlds, basically, that are connected to the spirit world. When Mahito goes within, I don't know if I keep on calling him Mahito. When Mahito, do I have to put on a fucking Japanese accent to not call him a fucking Mexican cocktail? When Mahito goes into the tower, he is then transported to one of these worlds in which he finds a bunch of parrots, his mother, who's actually a young version of her mother, because also the tower isn't just a world, it's also a time machine, and there's a bunch of parakeets everywhere, and by the end of the movie, the entire fake world collapses and then gets destroyed. Boy and the Heron is probably the most confusing Miyazaki film. I don't think there's many explanations for many things, but I don't know. I fucking loved it. It was great. Fuck you, plot. Who needs it? There's a plot. That's rude to say. There's a plot. Okay, so we know about the movies, but how are they in the same universe? You know, just because Ready Player One and Schindler's List have the same director doesn't mean that they take place in the same timeline. I get that, but in Miyazaki movies, there are tangible, real references sprinkled throughout all of his films, linking them together. These are obvious little things that anybody could probably notice as long as you just pay attention. Things like the turrets in Castle in the Sky showing up on Howl's Moving Castle, or the fox squirrels from Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind being on Laputa, or the soot sprites from Totoro showing up in Spirited Away. These are obvious little nods, and they aren't just meta references to his other films. They feel intentional and part of the world, making the crossovers feel less self-referential and more just development of concepts. The most prevalent being the soot sprites from both Totoro and Spirited Away. Both movies give us context and information of how they work in their respective films. They aren't tucked away in the background like the others. This isn't a reference. This is world building. And because of that, I believe that the turrets on Howl's Moving Castle actually came from the movie Castle in the Sky, and the ancient Laputians took the fox squirrels to save them from extinction from the time of Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind. But let's be real, that's obvious. So obvious I have no doubt in my mind that 1,000 Reddit theories have already come up with something like this. Like hell, I think anybody who watched the very popular Super Carlin Brothers video from like 10 years ago about the Pixar theory by John Negroni probably were like, hey, I could probably do that about Ghibli films. Like, that's what I did. But I will say I didn't take anyone's theory. This whole video has been crafted by me after hours of research and looking through random articles and interviews with Miyazaki. So technically, this is my idea, even if it isn't an original one. I don't read Reddit. I deleted it the moment I got pussy. So, I present to you the complete and chronologically made Ghibli story. Miyazaki timeline. Whatever you want to call it. In ancient times, the land lay covered in forest, where from ages past dwelt the spirits of the gods. Spirits, nature, and the world all lived together, But the more man started to develop, the more and more separate the spirits became, ultimately making two worlds of existence, the physical world and the spiritual world. Kinda. I know in most media, the spirit world is depicted as something like a separate plane of existence or a different dimension that is connected to the world but ultimately separate from it. But in Miyazaki movies, I don't believe that the spirit world and the physical world are connected at all. I believe that they are the exact same thing. You're just looking at it through two different perspectives. So the development of man didn't create two separate worlds, spiritual and reality. It dampened the perspective of man in order to only see the physical and not the spiritual. This is why in Princess Mononoke, everybody can see spirits, but in Totoro, only kids can. Because they haven't been brainwashed by man's hubris. See, the spirit world is a state of mind. Mei can sometimes see the baby Totoros and also sometimes see the entrance to Totoro's den, but not all the time, because she isn't spiritually connected all the time. That is until the end of the movie, where we see Mei and Satsuki eat corn on top of the tree with the cat bus. But what do their parents see? Nothing. Well, not nothing. They see the corn, and then the mom does say that she almost saw Mei and Satsuki in the tree, but then does make it clear that they aren't there right now. Their mom and dad can't fully see Mei and Satsuki at this point because they don't know how to. Yes, our minds will perceive it as two separate worlds, for instance in Spirited Away, but there is no definitive portal or place where they transfer into the spirit world. It's just seamless with reality, because for weird, unforeseen circumstances, for some reason, we're spiritual enough in that moment, and then they weren't able to not be spiritual after that moment. We even see within Spirited Away two different versions of the same thing, one spirit perspective and also one physical reality perspective. People like the Amishi wanted to fight against this new development perspective, but of course they were genocided by the Emperor 500 years before the events of Princess Mononoke, leaving Ashitaka's tribe to go into hiding. Princess Mononoke actually shows us a pretty pivotal point in which this perspective was lost, when Lady Uboshi kills the Shishigami. This event made ancient gods like the Boar clan and the Wolf tribe weak and stupid, and eventually led to their extinction. So let's use a timeline to visualize this. Alright, new camera angle, how about that? So, what time period is Princess Mononoke set in? Well, it's pretty explicitly set in the Sengoku period, which was a time of mass civil war and social upheaval brought about after the emperor lost the feudal state.
And the whole country broke into pieces. Everyone is fighting with each other for local power, and it's anybody's game.
This is why the women in Irontown dismissed the emperor's authority. The Sengoku period takes place from 1467 to 1615. A pretty wide window. But we can narrow it down even further because the matchlock rifles seen in the movie weren't introduced to Japan until 1543. And to go even further, Miyazaki has stated in interviews that the samurai seen in the film are represented by the Miramachi government, which means that this takes place in the Miramachi period. Oh, but Marcus, you said it was the Sengoku period. Yes, correct. They overlap because Japanese history is confusing and stupid. So, looking at everything, we can pretty confidently narrow it down to somewhere between 1543 and 1573, giving us a margin of 30 years. I don't think I can narrow that down any further. But for the purposes of this video, it's so far apart from all the other movies on the timeline that I don't think any of this mattered, and I might just be autistic. So on the timeline, we can see that the Shishigami gets killed somewhere between 1543 and 1573, and as we know, 500 years before the events of Princess Mononoke, the Amishi people get genocided. Moving forward a few hundred years, in 1868, the meteorite from Boy and the Heron hits Japan. And then 30 years after that, Grand Uncle builds a tower around it. Meteorites show up a lot in Miyazaki movies, actually. Calcifer is basically a meteorite, Jiro falls asleep to his first dream underneath a meteorite shower, and Potsu's mining village is surrounded by craters, which I only assume are from meteorites themselves. There's even a brief instance within Grand Uncle's world from Boy and the Heron, where we see a meteorite shower. Because of this, I believe that meteorites are highly connected to spirits, possibly indicating that spirits are cosmic in nature. Speaking of the Grand Uncle, we see within the worlds he's created spirits known as the Wada Wada, which are explicitly told to us to be the souls of unborn human beings. Not only that, but also black transparent figures, which also appear in Spirited Away, by the way, which are highly implied to be the dead. So, did the Grand Uncle create the afterlife? Is he God? No, I don't believe that somehow some weird time shenanigans made Grand Uncle the creator of the afterlife. At the end of the movie, when the tower gets destroyed, it's notable that the Wada Wada and the translucent black spirits never exit the tower. Because in my opinion, I don't believe that the Grand Uncle has the ability to create worlds at all. Instead, he just has the ability to manipulate the perspective that we've been talking about to whatever his desire is, which actually kind of manifests itself as being not such a great thing, even parasitic at some times. You see the pelicans eating the Wada Wada, and they're doing so because they've been entrapped by the Grand Uncle. And I'm also pretty sure that the Grand Uncle is Miyazaki's self-insert character, so I don't know what that says about his own self-worth. Does he think like his work is parasitic? Maybe. But definitely full of malice. Very, very pretty malice. Okay, so going back to the board, the next notable date is in 1868 again, same day that the meteorite hits. Patsu's dad takes a picture of Laputa, and we know which year that is because on the picture it is dated. The events of Castle in the Sky would most likely take from 40 to 50 years in the future, but we just don't know. There's just no way of telling. If I had to guess, it would be like 1910, but I guess it's not really important enough to put on the board. A few years after 1868, a sailor off the coast of Japan is caught in a storm and has a near-death experience, in which he enters the spirit world, and he is visited by the sea goddess. After this point, he instantly falls in love and then researches spirits. He eventually finds out that spirits all left due to humanity. After learning about this, he confesses his love to the ocean. She replies with a question: "Are you willing to give up your humanity in order to be with me?" He accepts. By the way, his name is Fujimoto, and he's Ponyo's frickin' dad. The next notable date we have is in 1871, with a bitter Fujimoto, recently become sea husband, looks at the rise of the Japanese Industrial Revolution, doesn't like that very much, and then casts a giant tsunami onto Japan. If you didn't know, within Fujimoto's vault there is a bunch of dates. All those dates then correlate to different tsunamis that have hit Japan. The reason why I suspect Fujimoto lost his humanity just a few years before this is because that correlates with the rise of the Japanese Industrial Revolution. And that seems very fitting for Miyazaki. Speaking of tsunamis, Fujimoto must have gotten a kick out of the first one because he does another one in 1907, and that's our next notable date. In 1916, Jiro Horikoshi has his first dream on top of his roof while a meteor shower happens. This will be significant later. I'm not too sure if that date is correct. I got it from IMDb, and as best to my research, I couldn't really find a definitive date, but 1916 seems as good as ever. In between 1907 and 1916 would be Castle in the Sky, but I'm not going to put it on because there's, again, no way of actually knowing. In 1918, Marco Rusolini briefly enters the spirit world and becomes a pig. We know the date because it's stated that it happened in the last summer of the war. Miyazaki curses are a little interesting. They're always a little, self-inflicted. I believe that curses in the Miyazaki verse basically work if you believe something to be true, the spirits will manifest that for you. Porco, after being witness to the horrors of World War I, believes that he is no longer capable of being a human anymore. And because of that, the spirits then abide by his wish and he becomes a pig. If you happen to be eating like a pig and you feel like a pig, you might also become a pig. If you're insecure, maybe you're gonna look old and ugly. Both in Porco Rosso and in Howl's Moving Castle, we see these curses never actually break officially. They more just only manifest themselves in certain situations. So when Porco regains his hope for humanity, or happens to forget that he lost it in the first place, he becomes human again. Same with Sophie, who de-ages whenever she feels secure in her body. In 1923, Jiro has his second dream with Caproni. This isn't very relevant, but since I put on the first dream, I'm putting on the second one. We know the date because there's a very famous earthquake that happens in the movie. We could just look it up in Wikipedia. In 1930, the events of Porco Rosso play out. Speaking of which, Miyazaki once stated in an interview while being asked about Porco Rosso's time period, and I quote, "I'd wanted it to be somewhere around 1928, but the World Depression hadn't begun by that time, and it still hadn't reached Italy by 1929. So it ended up taking place in 1930. We sort of fudged it on the dates." That's the sentiment we're going to be taking for this video, if you couldn't tell already. I'm not even at World War II yet, and I'm nearly out of space. By 1940, Jiro has completed his work on the 6 a.m. Zero fighter. At this time, Naoko, his tuberculosis wife, has left him to go die in the mountains so that he doesn't have to see the rest of her disease in the last few days of her life. In 1944, the events of Boy and the Heron play out. And we know that because of the most confusing piece of dialogue in any Ghibli movie ever. I just want you to know my frustration right now. I think I might have gotten a bad copy of this movie. I did watch this movie in theaters, but for research purposes, I had to do some legal actions. Listen to this. 3 years of war have passed since I lost my mother. Now 4 have passed, and my father and I left Tokyo. What? Did 3 or 4 years pass? I have no idea. I don't understand that line of dialogue. That is the most confusing piece of dialogue I've ever heard. But the consensus online seems to be that it's actually 3 years of war happened, then my mom died, then 4 years more happened, and now we're moving away from Tokyo. I don't know how the translation was that bad, but holy crap. So, 7 years after the war started, 1944. 1945, the war has now finished and Jiro has his third and final dream of the movie, in which his tuberculosis wife comes from the dead and says, "Jiro, you must live." 1950, Fujimoto makes his last canonically known tsunami. 1955, Totoro takes place. It is very confusing figuring out what Totoro's time period is. It's like anywhere 50s. It could be 1953, it could be 1952, it could be 1955, it could be 1957. But luckily, I did find an article that basically explained everything to me. So link is in the description. Thank you to that one article. 1955 seems to be the most conclusive answer. 1982, Jiro does not in fact live and fucking dies. This isn't in any movie. It's just when the actual Jiro Hirokoshi actually died. So, why would that be significant? Because Jiro becomes a spirit. What spirit, you might ask? This guy. Okay, I get this might seem like a stretch, but I have my reasons, okay? So, throughout The Wind Rises, Jiro has a lot of dreams. And no, they are not magical, maybe, but they certainly are spiritual. He's not talking to the actual Giovanni Caproni, but he's definitely talking to a spiritual version of Giovanni Caproni, okay? This might be hinting on the fact that Jiro is a little bit more spiritually inclined than every other person. Just think about it. Jiro, the guy who dreamed of being a pilot ever since he was a little baby, cursed to stay on land because of his poor dumb eyes, finally achieves his dream in death by becoming a bird. That's very poetic, I would say. That's pretty cool. Not only that, when he has his first dream, there's a meteor shower, and we already established way far back that those are spiritually connected things and events. Perhaps the reason why he's in the past after dying in 1982 is because he used the meteorite from Boy and the Heron to go back to 1940 to meet his wife one last time before she dies. After all, he never got to say goodbye, right? But then all of a sudden he gets trapped by this guy, this Uncle Grandpa, and then he's like, no, I'm going to use you in my meteorite to do something. I don't know, like, does he own the heron? Like, how I don't know, it's unclear. And then he's trapped there for like a full 4 years, just right by the meteorite, not allowed to leave. And then he meets Mahito, and then they destroy the thing, and then he's finally free. Or perhaps all of those points are just absolute shots in the dark, yes, granted, maybe. But they were there to justify this last point, which I think is pretty damn convincing. In 1916, Jiro has his first dream, and within that dream, he dreams of flying a plane that looks like this. Checkmate, atheists. That is a lo-fi playlist. When the fuck did that happen? Don't look up how long that playlist is. You'll know how long I've been working on just this. But anyways, yeah, the plane. You cannot tell me that this is not connected to this. That is just way too similar. Why the sudden attitude shift? But I don't know. Spirits are weird. Don't fucking question it, dude. Sure, most spirits are embodiments of like trees or rivers or bathhouses, but I don't think it's a real big stretch to say that a human would become a spirit like once they die. Like, I'm pretty sure half of the people in Spirited Away were maybe humans before, like especially Lynn. All right, I'm pretty sure the Spirited Away takes place in 2000. Like, I'm not 100% sure, but that's a pretty good educated guess. And lastly, 2007, the events of Ponyo play out. I know that because I looked it up and a guy on Reddit figured it out for me. Thank you for translating a Japanese calendar for me. Sorry for making fun of the entirety of Reddit earlier. So this is the entirety of all comprehensive dates within Miyazaki movies. But you might be asking, I'm missing a few movies here. So what's the deal? Ghibli Phase 2, The Apocalypse. I believe after hundreds of years, society became so advanced that spirituality completely vanished. But the hubris of man, of course, would have disastrous consequences. The 7 Days of Fire described in Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind describes an apocalypse of unimaginable horror resulting in the destruction of industrialized civilization. From now on, the calendar will be reset to every day after this point. So instead of AD, it is now ASDF, after the 7 Days of Fire. All right, so here we are, year 0. The 7 Days of Fire happens, and then the apocalypse, end of industrialized civilization. The fire giants then end up all dead after the war, and from their corpses springs the Sea of Decay. Not only that, but within the Sea of Decay, giant monstrous Ohm creatures come out, and they protect the forest, mirroring the gods of old from Princess Mononoke. 1,000 years later, the events of Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind happen. After the events of the movie, to the next 200 years, the Tormekians continue to industrialize and militarize. While that happens, the Valley of the Wind learns the sacred nature of the earth through Nausicaa's legacy. And it's through this understanding that they learn a version of the spiritual perspective, like from the days of old. They also learn how to tap into the spiritual perspective by using spells, aka magic. That's right, Nausicaa's descendants are the first wizards and witches. These newfound wizards and witches, while using their talents, observe something. There is an abundance of spiritual energy deeply embedded into the earth. They then find a way to mold and harness that energy into different types of crystals and charms. These would then end up being the first Ethereum crystals. That's right, I lied to you. Castle in the Sky actually doesn't take place in the old timeline, it takes place in the new timeline. The Tormekians then saw the power and potential of these Ethereum crystals and set siege on the Valley of the Wind. In order to avoid any more bloodshed, the Valley of the Wind accepted their colonization and integrated themselves into the Tormekian Empire. Through this mix of now magic and militarized power, they became the most powerful nation in the entire world, creating an army of impenetrable robots in the image of the fire giants from so long ago. But even they couldn't outlast the toxic jungle, so they came up with a plan. After being the most powerful nation in the world, they would conquer it by conquering the sky. They created giant floating islands out of the Ethereum crystals and lived in the sky, avoiding any conflict from down below, and they rebranded themselves to the Laputians. It is also interesting to note that the symbol of the Laputians is relatively similar to the symbol of the Tormekians, having two appendages that may or may not represent the snakes of the Tormekian flag. The Laputians, still with their Tormekian militarized mindset, ensured their domination over the world by implementing weapons inside of this floating islands. Weapons capable of creating nuclear-like explosions. So in between the events of Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind and 200 years later, we have the Valley of the Wind discovers magic, the Tormekians use and take that magic, and Laputa is then created, and then sometime after that, Castle in the Sky happens. But wait, how does Castle in the Sky happen after the apocalypse? That doesn't make sense. The photo that Patsu's dad is clearly marked 1868, which lines up with the camera he used. And doesn't Patsu mention explicitly the book of Gulliver's Travels? And Muska in that movie also references the Bible. Those are some pretty compelling points I made up for you, and you would seemingly be correct. Or I would seemingly be correct. I did the research. Fuck you. But what if I told you Patsu's dad didn't actually take the picture in 1868 AD? He took the picture in 1868 ASDF. I think it's important to note that the technology of the film is that of 1900s technology, but also leans a little further into the fantastical, specifically in the same way that Nausicaa in the Valley of the Wind does. For instance, I don't think that the 1900s had ornithopters. Or even now. So was the only thing to survive the complete and utter destruction of industrialized civilization and also presumably all recorded history, the Bible? Yes, you heathen, God finds a way. And so does Jonathan Swift's 1726 novel Gulliver's Travels. There's just way too much evidence that Castle in the Sky takes place in the future. From the technology to the fact that things show up from Nausicaa in the Valley of the Wind, to the fact that all of the locations in the world are definitely not what we would presume Earth to look like. By the year 1200 something, the Laputians notice that the toxic jungle has started to die down. This creates a disagreement within the people of Laputa, between the people who want to stay in Laputa and harness its power, and between the people who think they should abandon Laputa and return the power back to the earth. This creates two factions, the traditionalist, magic-inclined Toel U Laputa,
and the name I inherited was Lushita Tualul Laputa,
meaning true rulers of Laputa, and the progressive, technological Palo Ul Laputa.
My real name is Romska Pala Ul Laputa.
We never learned what Palo means, but we can have our suspicions. If Toel means true, perhaps Palo means false, although that's a little on the nose, even for Muska. But my headcanon is that Palo means either New Age or progressive or new. Eventually, these two groups became contentious, and a civil war broke out. But because the Toel were the ones who built the robots, the Palo would not succeed, and eventually they would have to agree to abandon Laputa. But the Toel did agree that they would leave their capital city as a monument to their past lives. The two factions traversed the world separately after that point, with the Palo becoming a militarized state and the Toel immersing themselves into society and keeping their magic secret throughout the generations. Many years later, in 1868 ASDF, Pazu's dad takes a photo of the flying castle of Laputa. Then, in the 1900s something, the events of Castle in the Sky happen. Then, sometime after that, is Howl's Moving Castle. My guess is somewhere between 30 and 40 years later. So, there have been wizards for around 900 years at this point. They've just been kept in secret, like in Sheeta's society. But in the events of Howl's Moving Castle, wizards and witches are basically commonplace. They're implemented into the military themselves. So what happened? Well, Kingsbury is actually a state formed by the ancient Laputians, the Palo. So once Kingsbury found out about wizards, they were like, guess what we're gonna do? We're gonna militarize them. That's right, wizards are commonplace in Howl's Moving Castle because of imperialism. Oh boy, does society never learn! Remember how cars are considered rare in Castle in the Sky? Well, that's because that shit takes oil. And there's been millennia of people mining that. So eventually, they started to run out. So how did society adapt? Well, they started using steam-powered vehicles, like the one seen in Howl's Moving Castle. They gotta save that oil for giant militarized flying ships to invade other countries for more oil. In fact, the war in Howl's Moving Castle is about invading other countries for their oil. Yes, it seems like the prince is the reason why the war happens in that movie.
They say their prince is missing. Yeah, that sounds like they're gonna start a war over it.
But that is just a front. The prince is 9/11 and Miyazaki agrees with me. Look it up.
I'm the prince who's been missing from the neighboring kingdom.
And with that, that is all the Miyazaki movies put into one universe. Oh, shit. What about Kiki's delivery service? Okay, that's fine. It's fine. It will just go right after Howl's Moving Castle, I think. Although that wouldn't really work with the technology. So I guess it happened in like the 50s. People just never talked about the witches in Sweden. Okay, so apparently, according online, Kiki's delivery service takes place in a separate timeline in which World War I and World War II never happened. So it couldn't have taken place before the apocalypse. And it really can't really fit here because the technology is so vastly different. An alternative timeline. A separate universe. It's in a separate universe. Canonically. Are they all in separate universes? What the hell was I even thinking? Like, if I made those movies, I wouldn't want them all to be in the same interconnected universe. That would be so creatively unfulfilling. Why am I limiting his art? Art that means so much to me. Art that has emotionally, transcendently expressed something to me in a way I can't even articulate. Was all this video for nothing? Would Miyazaki be disappointed in me? Am I Goro? Wait, that doesn't make sense. I'm a genius. I figured it out. Okay, so basically, the events of Howl's Moving Castle play out as they do in the movie, but then at the end, afterwards, when it seems all peaceful and nice, another war breaks out because, yeah, oh boy, they never learned. Howl, believing he is the only one to stop this cycle of violence, goes into battle, but eventually loses himself to his magic and becomes a bird permanently. This does reverse his arc from the movie, but let's be honest, Hal's a drama queen. He'd probably do it anyways. Sophie goes insane, just being like, I can't live anymore unless I cure my avian boyfriend. She then becomes a witch. It's not that unplausible for her to be one. Like, she's a witch in the book. And she's been around Markle and Howl long enough to pick up some tricks. I'm sure she could become a witch. She dedicates her entire life in order to cure Howl, but nothing seems to work, and no other witches and wizards seem to know how to cure him either. But then she thinks in her head, hey, didn't I time travel that one time? That's right, she did. She used one of Howl's rings through his magic door in order to see him when he was just a little kid. She thinks of that and goes, I need another one of those rings. And what are those rings made out of? You guessed it, it's Ethereum. Both the ring in Howl's Moving Castle and also the necklace in Castle in the Sky act extraordinarily similar, to the point where it's like, yeah, those are just the same thing. Howl maybe was a descendant of the Toel Laputians and then just inherited that ring from like generations passed on. Sophie now realizes she needs Ethereum though. But where is she gonna get Ethereum? Well, she lives in a castle flying through the sky, and eventually, just by chance, she finds a castle flying through the sky. Kind of, sort of. It's mainly only like a tree now. But that castle is floating using one of the biggest Ethereum crystals known to man. And she just yoinks that bitch. She then spends like an unimaginable amount of time turning Howl's Moving Castle into a time machine. Then she's like, okay, I'm gonna go back and save Howl now. But she's a novice witch. She doesn't really know what she's doing that well. And plus, this is the biggest unstable Ethereum crystal known to man. So what happens is she goes back in time and she gets transported thousands of years back in time to a random date. What is that date, you might ask? 1868, the time in which the meteorite fell in Boy and the Heron. That's right. Howl's Moving Castle turned into a time machine, turned into a meteorite to go into Boy and the Heron time. This explains exactly why the meteorite in Boy and the Heron is a time machine in the first place. Not only that, what does the time machine use? Doors to go back in time. Exactly how it was like in Howl's Moving Castle. And the Ethereum stone is the exact same stone we see that Granduncle used in order to actually create these worlds. It's just been mutated and warped through time and space. Sophie is now stuck in 1868 with only a weird transformed Howl's Moving Castle into a giant magical meteorite she has no idea how to use and no idea what the hell to do with. Sophie eventually accepts her fate and tries to go about her life as normal as she can. But she sees a world in constant disarray and in constant violence and in constant war. She then comes up with a plan. I'm gonna create a sisterhood of only women who become actual witches. Sophie's then band of newly made witches go out into the world, going from town to town, making sure that everything stays in order and nobody is gonna kill anybody. She does this because she believes that war is a product of male ego, like some fucking feminist. Gross. Women will never understand how cool it is to die in war. This then stops the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand from ever happening because he's saved by a witch, therefore stopping the events of both World War I and World War II so Kiki's delivery service can happen. And then Sophie moves to Sweden for some reason and she's Kiki's grandma. Booyah! Admittedly, a dark ending for Howl. But we must make sacrifices in order for the timeline to make sense. So you might have some questions, and I get that. The main one probably being that if Sophie traveled back in time to 1868 in the meteorite, and then changed the events of time in order for the World War I and World War II to never actually happen, how does the meteorite show up in Boy and the Heron? Because I'm pretty sure I saw a bomb go off in that movie. And with that, I will now exclusively only be talking about time travel for the rest of this video, because I want to, and I think about it a lot. Okay, so first things first, if you didn't know, time travel doesn't actually exist. We can theoretically go forward in time, but it's physically impossible to ever go back in time, at least to our current understanding of science. But I'm not a physicist. That shit's for nerds. I'm a creative, which means that when we're dealing with time travel, we make shit up. So, there are two narrative tools that we can use in order to create time travel stories. Those would be soft time travel systems and hard time travel systems. Hard time travel systems use laws made up by the creator in order to avoid logical paradoxes, whereas soft time travel systems don't. So instead of hard time travel system and soft time travel system, I call them the one that makes sense and fuck you, I'm Marty McFly. I like this option because I like to think about the stories that are told to me. Not to say that Back to the Future isn't fun. So there's two rules in which hard time travel systems normally fall into. At least the ones that I can think of. The first one being the branching timeline, meaning that anytime you go back in time, you are creating a separate parallel universe, exactly the same as your old one, except for the changes in which you made while going back in time. I think the best utilization of this rule in any media is the anime series Steins;Gate, where our main character puts his memories back in time to a previous version of himself, creating a separate timeline visualized by this very nice tree. The movie Endgame also states that it uses this law, until the last 10 minutes in which it goes full Marty McFly after making fun of that movie for a full 3 hours. You gonna tell me how this makes sense?
No. No, I don't think I will.
Fucking okay. The second rule I can think of is the time loop. Basically, the time loop posits the fact that the universe itself will never make a paradox happen, ever. This is Fry becoming his own grandfather, and my own personal favorite example, the entire series of Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. In Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, our main character accidentally sees his future self from him traveling back in time, which means from the present to whenever that point happens, he will never die. Meaning that he can do whatever the hell he wants in any way that he wants, and the universe will always make that point happen. I guess it should be better like this. Like maybe the arrow comes out this side here. It's a really fun show. I recommend anybody watch the first season and then stop. So looking at both of these rules, which one are we gonna use for our timeline? Both, bitch! Alright, when Sophie goes back in time to 1868 to get stuck, she creates a time loop. But she doesn't travel back herself. Rather, she creates an anchor in order to appear in 1868. What is that anchor? The anchor is the meteorite. Once she actually does travel through time, she exits out of the anchor, then creating a separate timeline. That is until 30 years later, while the grand uncle finds it, then creates a time machine within the meteorite that can travel to any point in history as long as it happens before 1868. This grand tapestry Miyazaki has laid out for us is a beautiful story of love versus war, man versus nature, and the cyclical ways history repeats itself. But what I didn't mention is that within this time loop, which basically covers the entirety of the films besides Princess Mononoke, is predetermined, meaning that, well, Totoro doesn't have free will and God is dead. Good night, everybody!